Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21 say, "Now when Jesus heard that John the Baptist had died, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, 'This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves.' Jesus said to them, 'They need not go away. You give them something to eat.' They replied, 'We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish.' And he said, 'Bring them here to me.' Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds, and all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides the women and children." If you read through the Gospel of Matthew, the gospel on which we have been focusing most lately in our midweek messages, there will likely be certain patterns or themes that emerge. And one of those themes pointed out by scholars is the presence of Matthew's 2 kingdoms. Throughout the gospel, the writer of Matthew is constantly contrasting the kingdom in which the actual earthly events portrayed in the narrative are set, the kingdom of the Roman Empire, ruled and controlled by Caesar, his armies and his appointed governors, particularly Herod Antipas, with the kingdom of God, initiated and displayed by the actions, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In our story today, the contrast between these 2 kingdoms becomes very apparent. It becomes very apparent that there are different values within each kingdom, different ways of treating people, and different priorities among those who rule. The kingdom of Rome was marked by great inequalities in wealth and access to food and nourishment. Besides the overwhelming force of its armies, Rome controlled the people it ruled by controlling their resources. Many of the people, particularly those in the city regions, were dependent upon the government to provide their food. It was through this dependence that Rome was able to exert control. And yet, in our passage for today, we see Christ bestowing food upon the people out of his love and compassion for them in one of the most easily recalled miracles in the entire Bible. By the end of the passage, everyone in attendance that day is fed and happy. They ate their fill, we would say. I really have very few vices, but food is certainly one of them. I love to eat good food, but portion control can certainly not be one of my strong suits. I have a tendency to eat and eat until I am full. I have a tendency to eat until I cannot eat anymore, even asking my wife sometimes to just take the food away from me for my own good. I'll be stuffed and have to push away from the table before I explode. And that's the way it is in many places throughout the United States, especially in the South, when we use food to express our love for each other, particularly, say, around the holidays like we're about to experience. Having too much food to eat, where much of it is thrown away, is what we might call a first world problem. For most of the world today, even in many places here in the United States, the ability to eat until you are full may come once in a lifetime, if even at all. And in Jesus' time, it would have been unheard of. And yet on that day, when Jesus prepared the meal, everyone ate and had their fill, and they had more leftovers than they knew what to do with. If this is a sign of the great banquet we will have when we get to heaven, or when earth at last looks like heaven, then I want a reservation at that table now. When Rome controlled the food, they withheld it until the people bowed to their will. Christ gave it out in more abundance than they could possibly have ever imagined. And everyone went home full, happy, and amazed. But the story started out with a much different tone. We began reading at verse 13 with Jesus withdrawing to his deserted place. But unless you read the first 12 verses of the chapter, you may have no idea of the context that sets the scene, except the fact that I added it. Chapter 14 begins with another banquet, this one in the house of Herod Antipas, the Jewish governor over the region, appointed by the Roman government. He had bought into the system of excess power and control. In fact, he thought he was pretty much above the law, could do what he wanted. Herod had become displeased with his wife and had become infatuated with his brother's wife, Herodias, and wanted her for himself. Believing a tetrarch, he could do whatever he wanted. He divorced his wife and took Herodias away from his brother. I once heard it said that the best preachers come to the pulpit with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in another. And that's exactly what John the Baptist did. News of Herod's actions would have been widespread, and John the Baptist spoke out against him publicly. Well, as almost every ruler, Herod knew that the best way to deal with a threat or opposition is to get rid of it entirely. So he wanted to kill John. But thinking politically, he knew that the people believed John was a great prophet and had great respect and admiration. Even those areas controlled by Rome were still only able to do so by appeasing the mob. And Herod feared what the mob might do if he killed John the Baptist like he wanted. So instead of killing him, he bound him and threw him in prison until Herod's birthday. On Herod's birthday, a great and lavish banquet was thrown, and I'm sure that everyone who was anyone was there. I'm sure that those who made the guest list were specifically chosen, and those who were not on the list were not welcome at the banquet table. And with any good party, you don't only provide the food and the drink, but you must provide the entertainment as well. So Herod had his stepdaughter, Herodias' daughter, Salome, dance for the crowd. Herod was very pleased by her dancing and wanted to show his approval both to Salome and to those looking on. So he offered her any gift she could think of in his entire kingdom. When you are promised anything you could ask for, sometimes coming up with a request could be quite daunting. So Salome sought the counsel of her mother, Herodias, who knew what John the Baptist had been saying about her. I don't know if Herodias loved Herod over Philip, her first husband, but she was apparently an ambitious woman who liked the position of power in which she sat, and she didn't want to feel threatened. So she told Salome to ask Herod to give her John the Baptist's head, and that it should be brought to her on a platter. Herod was torn between the political mess he would have to clean up if he honored this request, and the loss to his reputation, if nothing else, if he did not follow through on his oath to his stepdaughter. Reluctantly, he consented to the request, had John the Baptist immediately executed, and his head was presented to Salome and to Herodias. News of John's death spread and eventually came to Jesus himself, his cousin and his brother in the ministry. The herald who came first announcing the one who was to be sent by God had been killed. And when Jesus heard this, he got into a boat and withdrew from where he was, and he went to what Matthew called a deserted place so that he could be by himself. But his opportunity to grieve didn't last long, because it wasn't long before the crowds found out where he was and surrounded him again. We have seen our share of grief as a family of faith. We all know it as individuals as well. I'm coming to realize through my experience that people grieve the loss of loved ones, especially here in the South, but we still worry about our obligations and what other people might think or want. If you've been around grieving people long enough, you know that each person grieves differently. And my advice has always been that decisions about things like funeral arrangements and timing, while always being concerned to some degree for all who might be grieving, should be made with the best interest of the deceased's immediate family first. But apparently, even in grief, Jesus cannot get away from his obligations to us. When I am sure that almost every one of us would have seen the crowd coming and said, "Look, guys, I just need some time. I'm not ready to come back yet. I still need to heal. I need to grieve. Please come back later, and I will take care of you then." Matthew tells us Jesus had compassion for the crowds and got right back to work healing the sick. When it comes to this passage, everyone focuses on the miracle that 5,000 people were fed until they were full with 12 baskets left over. But the first miracle of this passage is Christ's compassion. When Herod was concerned with figuring out how to control his subjects and keep his marriage going at the same time, each of which was mostly a concern for his own advancement and maybe his own peace of mind at best, Christ gave up all concerns for his own needs and attended to the needs of the people right in front of him. There's a second miracle that is often overlooked as well. If the way that Christ's work was passed on to his disciples, I imagine this scene like I have seen many medical clinics operate in the missions field. If you've ever seen one at work, you probably know what it looks like as well. The first person with whom those who come for treatment meet takes their information and tries to discover what their most pressing needs are. They're then ushered to the next person, usually a nurse, who does the diagnostics, taking temperature and other vital signs. Then they're ushered in to see the doctor, who examines them, determines what they need, and offers some kind of treatment. And usually then they're taken to a place where they can receive vitamins, other medication they might need, and someone prays with them. Well, the process may have not been exactly the same. That's what I think of when I read this passage and Jesus healing the sick. The disciples are doing the crowd control, perhaps, ensuring that each person gets to see the great physician when they are able. While the disciples looked on as Jesus healed the sick, they must have become aware eventually of the time. I can almost imagine Peter coming over as Jesus examines a sick child and whispering in his ear, "Jesus, this is a deserted place and it's getting late. We've got to close down shop for the day. I'm getting a bit worried about what these people are going to do for food if they stick around for much longer. By the time they get back to their cities and homes, the restaurants and the markets, they're going to be closed. Where will they get something to eat?" And it's almost as if Jesus looks back at Peter and says, "Peter, if you want to follow me, then you are going to have to learn that being my disciple means meeting the people's needs yourself. They need not go away. You give them something to eat." The second miracle continues today as every one of us is offered the opportunity to partner in the service of Christ's kingdom. Serving and meeting the needs of others has always been and always will be a mark of discipleship. We know this, and we look out at the world and its complex problems requiring even more complex solutions. We have no idea where to begin. We wonder what we can do to even make a dent in the problems we see there. We don't feel like we have very much to give. Jesus, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's not going to make much of a meal, especially for this many people. But Jesus always says, "Bring me what you have and let's see what we can do." You serve them. Though the first and second miracles of the passage are often overlooked, we still need to recognize the most obvious. This is the only miracle that is told in all 4 of the Gospels. Theologians and scholars and pastors have debated the veracity of this story. Some have said that it is fact, and Christ multiplied 5 loaves and 2 fish to the point that 5,000 people ate their fill. Others have said that the miracle was about the fact that sharing what you have is contagious, and the people began sharing whatever they had, which overflowed beyond what it would have been if they had hoarded it all for themselves. Others have said this never actually happened and that it is simply a great lesson on the service that is required of all disciples. It might have even been a little bit of all 3. But I will leave that up to you and your own theology and the Spirit work with you. Regardless of the historic nature of the event, I think that the message each of the 4 evangelists is trying to get across is pretty clear. No matter what life is like in the other kingdoms and empires in which we find ourselves, in God's kingdom, everyone's needs are met. God never abandons us to fend for ourselves. God is always a God of compassion and provision, never leaving us in our time of need. The trouble with focusing on miracles, at least if we focus on the particular details and not the more general lesson, is that we may be very tempted to look at what Jesus did in the particular event, look at the hunger in our world and ask, why doesn't Jesus work like this anymore? I'm not even sure if miracles actually occur at all. But if we look deeper at this passage, then we might just discover that miracles continue to occur all around us every day. When people look beyond themselves with compassion for others, when we answer Christ's call to service, giving what we are able, even if it is small, when we do what we are able to meet the needs of others as a reflection of God's kingdom, believe me, that miracles happen every day. Let us pray that we will see them and be willing to partner with Christ in bringing them into this world.